So my Twitter feed is very, very curated. I am very careful who I follow, what I read, and what kind of input I have. So I have thinkers. I have people in the investment community who are really bright. I have philosophers. I have new age thinkers. I have money Twitter, which is really kind of interesting to follow. Health people. I want to really carefully curate what comes into my world. Of course, I have my side feed that has all my political and all the other things that I don't really want to talk about. But if you looked at my Twitter feed, you would know that I'm feeding myself good stuff, not on the side. And one of those people, Gregory Sadler, has been on my feed since my friend Dan Greller suggested that I follow him and think about having him on the podcast. He's the president of Reason IO, where they take resources from complex and often difficult philosophical texts and thinkers and make them accessible to non-philosophers like me. They transform ideas into useful tools for application, reflection, decision-making, and action. He does public speaking. He does philosophical counseling, coaching, tutorials. They have a ton of online classes. He's got over 1,700 videos with 8 million views. So he has a following, and his teaching goes far and wide. Greg, thanks for being on the show.
Well, thanks for having me. I think this is a great topic to get into. How do you manage this time of life that so many people, I think, just kind of want to write off, you know?
So we were joking when before we started, like someone goes and reads a Ryan Holiday book on Stoicism and they think they understand philosophy. And when I was following it's the depth of where you go into the thinking realm, and to people who have really contemplated life and the challenges that we do. You bring a lot to the table. How'd you get into why are you a philosopher?
Well, there's a kind of silly story. By chance, basically. So I come from a non-academic family, and when you get into academics, you realize how much of academics is like a caste system, where people have been doing this for generations after generations. And I guess I was always interested in the realm of ideas. I didn't know it was called philosophy until I actually got into college, and started studying it more extensively. Actually, I have to take that back. I did have two encounters with philosophy in high school. I took an intro to philosophy class, which was just absolutely terrible, and it
I
was a
took I took
religion.
that same class. We all take that class.
The instructor was basically telling us, "Here's what I want you to know. Here's what to say on the test." And I was like, "Oh, this doesn't seem very, very cool." And we didn't read any primary texts or anything. We read this guy Martin Gardner, who was a writer for Scientific American. And then I also took this other class. It was supposed to be a sacraments class, and the nun who was going to teach it, she got sick and unfortunately died. So they brought in this little guy, uh, Mr. Lorenzo, and I never found out his first name. And I wish I could track him down because he was a really great teacher. He was from Seattle. He'd had this Augustinian conversion. He wanted to tell us all about Augustine. And so he starts this class and he says, in order to teach you about St. Augustine, I need to teach you about Plato and Aristotle. And he did it by he'd have us read little bits and pieces of the text, and then he'd like put a lot of stuff on the board and talk about their ideas. And most of the students were like groaning, oh, what's going to be on the test, I don't know how to do this. And I was like, well, this is really cool stuff. And then I read bits and pieces here and there. Like my uncle gave me The Myth of Sisyphus by Camus when I was like 14, and I maybe understood 10% of it.
Yeah, that's a
you know
great book for a 14-year-old.
Yeah. Well, I was interested in Greek mythology, so I'm reading it and I'm like, when are we getting to the Greek mythology part? So there was all of that stuff going on. And, I'd go to the library, and I think I encountered a good bit of philosophy through reading like sci-fi and fantasy. And then I went in the army and came out, and I was working in restaurants, and I was like, I got to go to college. This is kind of a dead end. I'm not too happy with this. And so I had no idea where to go to college. So I applied to a bunch of different places. The place I ended up going to, which is now a university, was called Lakeland. And my mom's boyfriend at the time said, as soon as you get up there to college, you declare a major right away, because then you're not just, any old freshman, you have like a connection. And so I looked down the list. The advisor was like, well, do you want to declare a major? And I looked down and I was like, philosophy. Well, that sounds cool. I'll do that. So I said, okay, well, we'll have to sign you up for this class and this class. And I wound up, just kind of progressing through the curriculum. I also picked up a math major along the way because it turned out I was good at it and enjoyed it once I realized that there was some theory there. And there were a lot of intersections between math and philosophy. And then I took a year off and worked here in Milwaukee, actually just blocks from where I'm living right now in this big office tower as a third shift security guard, which left me a lot of time for like reading. And I had to think, okay, so do I want to like try to find another job? Do I want to take the actuarial exam? Do I want to go to grad school for philosophy or for math? And I liked the philosophy stuff that I was studying. So I said, well, I'll go to, go to grad school. And I had no idea about like, what this is going to lead to, if I would teach or anything like that. And I think if I'd made a more rational approach, I probably wouldn't have done what I did. Right.
Yeah, I
So
don't
I
know
went.
that studying philosophy for a career is a rational thought.
Yeah, even back then. Now, the job market is terrible. Although there's lots of opportunities for philosophers outside of like traditional academia. And when I first got there, they handed you this paper that said only 66% of you can expect to get jobs. And I was like, well, I'll probably be in that 66%. No worries. And I took the classes I wanted to take, and it turned out that I almost like sort of like remember Mr. Magoo, who would be going along obliviously and everything else would be happening around him, but he always managed to like not get hurt. That was my career and my studies. I went to a place that was kind of a low tier, graduate school, but it turned out that they had awesome teachers and an amazing library, and I could pursue studies on my own that I wanted to do. And then I, instead of like going the traditional route, I bought in. My mother had died, so I had an inheritance, and I bought some of the family land and one of the houses on our family's land in rural Indiana. I just started looking for jobs around there. And the job that I happened to get was teaching for Ball State University in a maximum security prison. And I liked it. And, I probably would be there today if Indiana hadn't gotten rid of prison education. I'd study the things I wanted to study. And I didn't take a lot of guidance from people who wanted to offer it. And in most cases, that would be a terrible thing to do, right? But it worked out for me.
So
And
what I haven't heard in this story is
yeah.
I fell in love and got lost in my friends from hundreds and thousands and years
Oh,
ago.
yeah. Yeah. I mean, there were so many things that I wanted to research. Like for a while, I was doing philosophy of language. I was, so interested in how linguistic systems work. And so you encounter these great thinkers. And then, as I started like studying languages more extensively and reading things in the original, like for example, St. Anselm. I read Anselm when I was an undergraduate, didn't really understand what I was reading, decided to read him to work on my Latin, and then was just awed with, his thought. And it's I can say a similar thing about a lot of other philosophers, many of whom I don't really agree with, like say Rene Descartes. I'm not a Cartesian, but I love teaching his ideas to students and applying them. And I go back through his texts and reread them, at least once a year, whether I need to or not, right? So, and it's always enjoyable. Some philosophers are not good writers, they make you really work hard, like Hegel. He's a great thinker. He's not a great writer, but he's still, worth spending time with. And the other thing is, so yeah, you're right. You do fall in love with them and have a conversation, but I think coming to it without the sort of the baggage that being somebody from a university family would have, and always wanting to know, well, how do you live this stuff out? What's the practical application? That was really helpful
No,
because
that's the question. Like that. So that's why we're having a conversation. So
yeah,
here's my thoughts. Here's my uneducated thought. So we're going through life and we need something in our lives in order to make sense of the questions we have, of the choices we've made, and where we find ourselves. So
Yeah.
we can go into religion. We can go, we can find a new religion. We can go into the religion of our past. We can go into pop psychology, positive psychology. We can go into New Age. We
Mhm.
can meditate, or we can go into philosophy, right? Which now Stoicism is all the rage. Uh,
Yeah.
so what is where would you what Hmm. Sell me on philosophy versus
Okay.
positive psychology versus religion.
Okay, that's kind of a cool challenge. I'll say this to begin with. Those are all modes of what we can call intentional living, right? So
Hmm.
where you're living, you're doing things, you're in the world, you have to make decisions, and then the question is how to make those decisions more rationally. What resources do you need? What practices do you want to bring in? And there's a lot of great stuff that you can get from psychology, not just the positive psychology movement, but the whole cognitive stuff with REBT and CBT. Depth psychology, I think, has a really important role to play in helping us understand our traumas and why we do the dumb things we do. That's particularly important in midlife, right?
Oh yeah,
Because
that's the question. Why did we make the choices we make? How did we end
yeah,
up here? And
yeah,
now what do we do about the fact that we're here?
yeah. So I would say that part of what philosophical approaches like Stoicism or Platonism or Aristotelianism bring to the table is a really well worked out understanding of human nature, both our own psychology and you might say anthropology, what it is to be a human being, an anthropos, a human, and also our connection with others, right? Now there's some big gaps, especially if we're relying on ancient philosophy. There's problems they didn't consider that we have to kind of fill in. So you can't have a slavish devotion to, well, Cicero said this, so I better do things this way, right? There's a lot of interpretation that has to take place, but each of those, when you go into them, they're a really robust system. So Stoicism, to take a prime example, and we should probably talk about that because you're right, it is the most in the news and popular one. I mean, Ryan Holiday's a nice guy. He does better writing with Stephen Hanselman than on his own, I would say, when it comes to philosophy. I've talked with him personally, and he does know more than goes into his books, I would say. But it's still a pretty superficial level
It's a
approach
wonderful
to.
introduction to a new way of thinking.
Yeah, and so where do you go from there? Well, there's the classic texts, and we talk about the big three with Seneca, Epictetus, and Marcus Aurelius, and then there's other authors, and we could talk more about that, but I'm going to jump sort of ahead, and then we've got modern interpreters, some of whom are like straight out academics, and some of whom are more popular authors, but a lot of whom go into greater depth and detail. And the more depth that you go into it, the more you find that you can actually use, because Stoicism is a system. So, a lot of this is experimental or experiential. You invest the time to try to practice some of the things, you put in the study, and then you see if it pays off. And if it doesn't pay off, if it doesn't actually make your life better in there should actually like almost be metrics for this. Right?
Right.
If you can't say exactly what it's doing for you, then maybe either you got it wrong or it doesn't have the resources you thought, right? And then you move on to something else because life is short and we don't have to waste it on anything that's not going to have a real payoff for us. And so,
For me, my clients I have a requirement for my clients to do contemplation of some
mm,
sort. They don't have to meditate. They don't have to
okay,
journal. They don't have to do anything specific, but they do have to take a time. They have to figure out how they're going to take time to stop and contemplate
yeah.
life. It could be just sitting with a cup of coffee, looking out the window. It could be while they're exercising, running, or it could be meditation, but I don't really care. Right. So I think that this is kind of the same thing. There's a bunch of roads to take down here.
Yeah, and there's nothing that says that you have to um, only, if you're going to do stoicism, that you can only do stoicism, right? I tend to think that these things work way better when we combine aspects of them. I will say this thing about stoicism. So Donald Robertson, who's very popular author on modern stoicism, he and I were having a conversation, and this is before he decided to write his book, How to Think Like a Roman Emperor. and he's saying in his thick Scots accent, I've been doing CBT for years and years. He's a therapist, and I give people books like Albert Ellis or Beck, and these are very popular books, but people only read them once. They only read them cover to cover once, and then they'll go back, like with Beck, feeling good. I'm feeling depressed. I better read the chapter on depression again, right? But nobody goes back and reads them because they want to read them. Whereas people will go back and reread Marcus Aurelius or
Mhm.
Seneca because there's something more there. You could say, well, you could get the same payoff from reading this stuff, but there's something that's pulling people in, and it's not just a literary feature. There's something, you were talking about, like communicating or having a conversation with great minds. I think that's part of what's there. People say, I like to talk with Seneca, see what this guy had to say, even though he's been dead for 2000, yeah, about 2000 years, right? There's still something that I can tap into, and I think
Kind
you
of
can say
amazing. It's
similar.
kind of amazing to me how relevant a lot of those conversations are 2,000 years ago to now.
Yeah, and so there's something to be said. This is going to sound rather abstract, right? We talk in philosophy about human nature, and what is human nature? Well, we're the rational animal, right? And then a lot of that consists in, well, what the hell does that mean? What is it to be a rational animal? Does it mean we think more than, say, the chimps or the dolphins? Well, that's part of it. It also means that we have a different sort of communicational nature, because for the Greeks, logos means rationality and communication. But we don't really know fully what this kind of being is that we are, and we have to discover it through living our lives and through thinking about it. And we probably never tap it out. I doubt there's anybody who has like the definitive answer to it. But these classic thinkers, some of their work we have to get rid of anyway, but a lot of their work is still very applicable, because human nature hasn't fundamentally changed. There's still some constants to it, and they help us to explore those constants, and they help us to explore it across, you could say, sectors. So you were mentioning doing work, well, sales, for example, right? So sales is connected with rhetoric, is connected with understanding how organizations work, is connected with, and we can say this about a whole bunch of things. A good salesperson is not just somebody who can convince people to do something that they shouldn't do. It's to be an educator. It's to understand human motivations. There's all these things connected together. So if you can make sense out of human nature using philosophy in ways that are not, narrowly specialized, you can do that as an organizational psychologist, or you can do that as somebody who's going to come in and fix the HR department, you know, or help people figure out what's wrong with their, well, not just what's wrong with their screwed up family, but how to manage things when Thanksgiving comes around, right? So this is kind of a long circuitous route, but I think
You're a philosopher.
that's,
You're allowed.
yeah, I mean, studying philosophy, if you do it in the right way, can help you do that. And I think that the way that we often do it in our classes and curricula is not the right way. It's not totally unhelpful. An intro to philosophy class is probably better in that respect than some of the more advanced, we're only going to read these 5 articles by these 20th century authors kind of class. But even most intro classes aren't particularly good.
Mm.
So there's I don't mean to knock my own profession, but there's a lot of ground to catch up on.
Sure. So let's just say we're earnest and we're looking. So now I'm gonna put you on the spot. Let's see,
Ooh,
because I've gone through your YouTube channel, and
okay.
I know that you are an encyclopedia. So if I want to learn more about
Well, it looks
relation,
like that.
yes,
It
I
looks
want
like
to.
that because you only get to see the stuff that I've edited and put out there, right? So you don't see all of the false starts and lose my train of thought and have to stop the video. so,
Right now,
so go ahead.
dude, I now have 260 or 270 episodes of Mastering Midlife. So, I now have a portfolio, a Tools of Titans,
Yep.
like content. But no, but really, the question I have is I want to learn more about relationship, my, human relationships and people and all that. Who do I go study? Who would you pick up first?
Oh, first, this is going to sound like an oddball answer, Plutarch. Um, Plutarch, we generally know
He
because of
sounds
his
like someone from
Plutarch's
the
lives.
Jetsons, like, all right, so
Well, he was a biographer, right? And everybody has to read a bit of him usually in high school, like these parallel lives. But he was actually a moral philosopher of the Platonist school, and he was coming in late enough in the day where he could draw on stuff from the Stoics or from the Aristotelians, and he was really concerned with our relationship. So he has like pieces on like what it means to be a good spouse, for example. And now some of the stuff that he says is very culturally conditioned, and you don't want to like say, oh well, if he said it, I must. This is what I have to do. You got to take some of it with a grain of
sure.
salt. But I think he's a good person. When it comes to like studying philosophy, I always tell people, well, start with Plato. You read some dialogues. I mean, the Symposium would be kind of cool if you want to understand love. Aristotle's discussions of friendship in Nicomachean Ethics, books 8 and 9, are really good. Cicero has a great book on friendship, but oftentimes these are more about ideals and not enough about like, wow, my relationship is screwed up, man. How do I fix
No, got
this?
got
Right.
it. Totally got it.
So,
So let's say I want to learn more about organizations and that kind of
oh,
thing. Where do I go?
there's all sorts of places from ancient philosophers all the way up to stuff in the 20th and 21st century. um, as a matter of fact, I'll put in a plug for somebody who I like a lot, not just as a philosopher but as a person, because I've had the chance to meet and interact with him, and that's Alasdair MacIntyre. MacIntyre is somebody he's written a lot of books. He's done a lot of really great academic work. But he also used to do like work for organizations where he'd like write reports and stuff like that. And it's fascinating to read the things that he would say to them. And I think, he's a virtue ethicist. So he's putting forth an argument for why you need to cultivate things that we call the virtues, these habits, these dispositions like justice or courage or honesty. But he's like brutally realistic about what people's lives are like and capacities are like. He was actually a Marxist before he became a virtue
Hmm.
ethicist, and his particular orientation in Marxism kind of steered him towards Aristotle. So he's somebody I actually like quite a lot in that respect. There's a number of other
That's
people.
actually leads me to a question I was saving for you. Is like,
Oh, sure.
so who's in the 20th and 21st century that you would consider a
Mm,
philosopher?
great philosophers. So, there's the people who get a lot of buzz, like Slavoj Žižek. And I think that so this is probably going to any of your listeners who have read Žižek, I'll probably offend them by saying this, but I think he did his best work like 20 years ago, and what he's doing now is he's just kind of coasting on regurgitating stuff, and I don't think he's particularly
Hey, Stevie
helpful now.
Stevie Stevie Wonder did it, so he can do it.
Yeah, I mean, every time that Zizek comes out with a new book, you have to ask yourself, is this really worth my time to read? Or should I read one of his older books again? Or should I read somebody else? Because odds are it's probably not going to be, when you've invested the time, you'll be like, it really wasn't worth it. So there's people like that get a lot of notoriety. And then there's like we'll call them philosophers light, people like Jonathan Haidt, or Sam Harris, people that get looked at as like making contributions, but there's not an awful lot of like engagement and depth.
Mm.
And then there's all sorts of people like, so MacIntyre's, he's pretty old. He's thankfully seemingly in like pretty good health. He's past 90 and still, writes things occasionally. But there's some other people on the scene who are doing equally good work. Julia Annas, who's also, she's I think probably close to the retirement age, but not the end of her
So what is she
career.
bringing to the table? What are these people
Oh,
talking
really
about?
great investigations of what virtue would look like in our contemporary society. Um, helping us to understand what's there in ancient texts and early modern texts. She's a great reinterpreter. As a matter of fact, I like the people who aren't like trying to make a totally new contribution, but are helping us to like rethink this stuff in contemporary settings. Martha Nussbaum would be another similar person in that respect.
And what is she
Um,
talking about?
she spans sort of the gamut. She's got a recent book on anger that's particularly good, that I don't agree with in some respects, but I think it's particularly good. Um, and she writes a lot about ancient philosophy, but she's always like looking for how it applies to our contemporary lives. She's
I
done a
find
lot
if
of
I
work
really
in.
don't agree with something, that helps me figure out what I really think. So it's
That's
okay to
true.
like, if I read something and
Yeah.
it's like, no, that's not it, then I'm closer to what is it for me.
Yeah, and I think that there's a lot of people who read works looking to find something that they do just agree with, right? They want a program, but it is nice when you can acknowledge that somebody is a good scholar, is or a good thinker, but you do disagree with them. You can have like a reasonable exchange of ideas with them. Another person who's kind of, I would say, pretty important, Charles Mills. He's got this great book, The Racial Contract, that made us look at
Mm.
social contract theory and what we're doing in politics and who's been left out and why. And he's still continually working, Charles Mills. He's younger. And I mean, we could spend a whole episode just talking about different people that would come to mind.
Well,
I think,
I find it interesting because you don't, when you talk about philosophy, you generally think about thousands of years ago
yeah,
instead of thinking about who's thinking now, who's
yeah,
helping us. And
quite true.
thinking doesn't mean they're right. For me, it just means who's thinking and testing ideas so that I can play with it myself.
I'll give you an example of somebody who got themselves in hot water recently, who my wife has actually studied with, and that's Giorgio Agamben, who is I actually like quite a bit of his work, but he was one of these people who said that the European governments were overreacting to COVID, and man, did he provoke a lot of backlash. But he's certainly getting a conversation going. So he's a good example of
So
a
is
published
Jordan
philosopher.
Peterson a philosopher or just
He's a philosopher, but not a very good one, unfortunately. Sort of like Ayn Rand, people people will say, "Oh, she's not a philosopher," and there's like this incredible hatred of her in academic philosophy. I actually teach her works in my ethics classes, and I do so precisely because she has a large following, and I think it's important for students to read through her stuff and see where it's defective, where it's deficient. And part of where she goes wrong is like in her unfair assessments of other philosophers. Like you read about what she says about Kant and you're like, wow, she hates this guy's guts, and unnecessarily so. And Peterson is kind of like that. He's got some interesting ideas. Anything that's good in Peterson you can find somewhere else, I think.
Mhm.
And it doesn't have to come with all the baggage.
Right?
And then there's the like, there's the less savory aspects of his work and commitments as well. I think he really became a victim of his own success in many respects. Um, he was kind of this obscure guy. He was doing interesting talks that he was putting on YouTube. He was getting a following. He'd written a rather obscure book, Maps of Meaning, that a lot of people I think bought but didn't really understand. And then he got catapulted on the scene by controversies in politics, right? And I think he started to buy into like his own uh, myth of brilliance, and that's devastating for people when you do that. Nobody's as brilliant as everybody's telling you are, and
Humility is a hard thing to keep when you get to
to maintain. Yeah, and so I think that his work just started getting sloppier and sloppier.
Mhm.
When he showed up to debate Zizek, and Zizek is going to take the side of communism, and he admitted that he hadn't read any communist literature other than the Communist Manifesto. You're like, this is bad. This is a guy who, like, if he was in an undergraduate class, the professor would say, well, you're not debating today. go do the research, and you say, well, what would lead somebody to think they could do that? And I don't know, sense of entitlement maybe,
Yeah,
or
definitely hubris. So let's talk
yeah.
about let's talk about your work. So
Oh,
there's
okay.
1,700 videos, and I'm just like
Yeah.
looking at all the goodness in there. And if someone wanted to kind of dive in with you, where should they start?
So it kind of depends on what they're looking for. If a lot of people, I think, come because they want to begin studying philosophy, and so I've created these self-directed study in philosophy videos where I give some advice, like how would you do that with Plato? How would you do that with the Stoics? And unfortunately, I don't have enough of those videos yet. But eventually, I'm going to do that for pretty much anybody that I can talk about. And that's another thing too. If I don't understand the stuff, I don't do a video on it.
Right.
I, even if it's topical, even if it would get more views, yeah. If I can't say that I understand it, I'm not going to do it. For a lot of other people, they encounter them through these core concept videos, and I've got like over 700 of them now, and they're like 10 to 20 minute things on a particular idea. So
But
Plato's,
I think that's how we digest things now.
yeah.
If you're gonna get on the treadmill or get on the Peloton or something, and you're gonna
Mhm.
just watch something, a 20-minute video of you extracting something is very useful.
Yeah, and I use them in my own courses too. Um, they're really helpful for my students. That said, people do watch longer videos. It's funny. So if you don't mind a little digression, when I first got into the
You warned
video
me.
thing,
You warned me about the digression, so that's okay.
yeah. So the experts in education, who didn't turn out to be experts at all, were all saying, oh, you can't do anything longer than a 5-minute video. That is, back then it was the millennials, they can't watch anything for more than 10 minutes tops, right? And it's got to be highly produced. You got to have like sound effects and pans and stuff like that. And so I was like, well, I don't know that that's the case. And I just started doing these things where I would plunk a flip cam down on a tripod in my classroom and just record the class.
Hmm.
And people would watch it from the beginning to the end, you
Oh, of
know,
course. Yeah.
and YouTube would let us actually see the stats on that. And they would talk about stuff that happened like at the 45-minute mark, which lets you know they're watching the whole thing. So the educational experts were wrong in their sort of across the board assumptions. Now, what we do know is that people will watch if it's engaging. So if you have an hour of somebody talking in a monotone and just blah blah, that's not going to cut it, right? They'll hit that and jump away real quick. But if you're actually saying something interesting that'll hold people's minds for a while and get them thinking, they'll watch 2-hour videos. That said, you're probably right. It's better to have these little chunks because then people can kind of pick and
I'm
choose.
just thinking of me. I'm just thinking. I
No,
keep
there's
my podcast under 30 minutes, and I have like a 98% listen rate all the way through.
That's great.
I keep it short. We get to the point,
Yeah,
and then
that
hopefully I
makes
send
that
people
makes
off to go
sense.
go find more about the guests that I
I
have.
think with podcasts too, because you don't have the visual element, right?
Mhm.
Um, I think it does have to be shorter. I mean, what are your views on that? Does it make a difference, video to podcast in that respect? Or
I have it's probably 10 to 1 for me video to because I do put these videos out for closed
Mhm.
captioning so the hearing impaired can enjoy
Oh, nice.
talking
Yeah.
about. But thank Niall DeMarco for that. He had a whole campaign on people captioning videos. So I made a commitment to do that. But yeah, no, it's 10 to 1 for me. At least 10 to 1 for people who listen. Uh, probably 100 to 1 who listen on the podcast because I have people who listen all around the world.
Yeah. I started doing a podcast version of some of the shorter lecture videos because I had so many people who were saying, I listen to your YouTube videos, but I'd like a podcast because I'm using up all of this cellular data.
Totally. No,
Getting
I'm not walking the
so,
dogs. There's a couple people who only have videos, and I have to keep the
yeah,
YouTube on while I'm walking the dogs, and you put it in your pocket and it stops. And I wish they would just make the
yeah.
audio so I can listen. That's a,
That, and then there's ads too, on the YouTube stuff. So
totally. So besides, I'm going to put the link to your YouTube channel on the show notes. Where else can people find you?
Well, reasonio.com. That's my business site. I also have a Facebook author page. I'm on Twitter as philosopher70.
That's where I would
Um,
suggest people follow you, because that's where I found you, and I love just your
yeah,
your
I'm
input
a
on
bit more
everything from
political on
politics to
Twitter than I
everything.
am on other stuff. So, that's the saltier Sadler, you could say. Um, and then, I mean, what else? I mean, I do have the Sadler's Lectures podcast. I don't have anything like the amount of content in that yet that I do in the video channel, but there's a good bit there. And that's probably enough places. I'm very easy to Google because there aren't that many Gregory Sadlers, and all the ones that are out there do different stuff than I do. Like there's a drummer, and there's a guy who's a libertarian political candidate, and there's a photographer, but I'm the only Greg Sadler philosopher. So,
So what's interesting on the horizon for you? What are you creating next?
so actually, you might find this very interesting. So my wife and partner, Andy Shaka, is she does even more stuff than I do. She's actually director of programs and curriculum for the Food Business School, which is a spinoff of the Culinary Institute of America. She has founded a Milwaukee Food School, which is an online education hub for all sorts of things food related. I'm going to be developing business ethics classes and philosophy of food and things about the food systems for that, and I'm really excited to do that. And she's so tapped into the food scene in general. She's bringing in some really big movers and shakers into this project, so it's cool to see. Part of what I do is bounce ideas off of and support and work with somebody who I'm fortunate enough to have met. Actually, we went to high school together, and then met up later in life. There's a whole story there that I could go into. So there's all that stuff. And this coming year, I hope to teach less academic classes. I got to start saying no to more places. Otherwise, I get sucked into teaching too much and start doing more writing. I really have a lot of book projects I need to get to. But I'm going to keep churning out the video content and podcast content and, doing interviews and stuff like that.
That's great. So, like I said, I'll link everybody because I really would love people to follow you and learn from your, the wisdom that you glean from everybody, and then how you bring it out into the world, because it is a little salty. It's a little, it's just, it's you bring a humanity to it all that I
I come
really
from a
appreciate.
blue collar tradesman family, so I don't like to candy coat stuff.
No, it's greatly appreciated. So, thank you for being here. Thank you for being on the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yes, and to everybody else, really, really, really thank you for your time and attention. It's precious to me. I love you. Have a great rest of the day.